Hi everyone, Mike here from Bikes by Mike with another cycling related video. I'm back in the garage today to talk about bike maintenance, and specifically this right here. So I'm going to show you how to remove and reinstall a SRAM DUB mountain bike crankset. So first things first, why would you want to remove your crankset? Since this is something that very few home mechanics will do that often, if at all. But there's really three main reasons why you would or should do something like this. The first is if you need to repair or replace your chainring. And the only way to replace the chainring is to disassemble the whole crankset. The second reason is if you have to get access to the bottom bracket. So either just to check if the bottom bracket is working okay, if your bearings are turning freely, or if you need to fully replace the bottom bracket. Again, you need to remove the whole crankset assembly to get access to that area. So the third reason why you might want to do this is why I'm doing it today, which is just for general maintenance. It's an opportunity to pull everything apart, clean it, re-grease it, and have everything just turning smoothly. So SRAM introduced the DUB cranksets back in 2018 for what they say was an opportunity to improve bearing durability and also allow for cross-compatibility amongst cranksets. So the SRAM DUB cranksets are based on a slightly smaller than 30 millimeter axle. I think it's 28.99 millimeters if I recall correctly. And the whole crankset assembly itself is unique to SRAM. Every cranksets are kind of assembled or disassembled slightly differently. So the process I'm going to show you today only applies to the DUB cranksets, although SRAM's DUB line is quite wide. So the process will apply to any of their DUB cranksets, not just the one used here, which is set up with a SRAM XX1 Eagle 12-speed chainring set into PressFit 30 bottom bracket. So before we get started with disassembling the whole crankset, let's talk about the tools you're going to need for the job. I'll start off with those tools that are must-haves and then mention a couple other tools that aren't essential, but if you have them, they'll make your life a whole lot easier. So first, those tools that you absolutely need. So we need two hex keys. We need an 8mm hex key like this and a 2mm one. So the 8mm hex key you need to remove the crank assembly. The 2mm one is simply to adjust the preload. There's a preload spacer, a preload adjuster on the crank assembly, and that removes any play from the system. So it's important to get that adjusted correctly, and for that you're going to need a 2mm hex key. A rubber mallet is useful if you can't remove the whole crank arms by hand. Often have to be tapped out. And you definitely need a good premium grease. Doesn't have to be this grease from Finish Line. It can be any all-purpose bicycle grease will be just fine. Now for the nice to have tools. So there's two here. And this is essentially a breaker bar fitted with an 8mm hex socket adapter. And that fits into the crank assembly. And you'll see why this can be really helpful to remove the whole crank assembly. The other one is this beast, which is, let's see if I can get a shot here. So this is a frame or fork straightener tool. That's the main purpose of it, but it's also mighty handy to be able to grab and secure and get leverage on your pedal arms. So I'll show you how to use that. Again, these two are not absolutely essential. They just give you a heck of a lot of leverage that you don't have if you're relying on a tiny 8mm hex wrench like this to remove your crank assembly. Okay, the first step in removing the crankset assembly is to deal with the chain. And you basically need to remove it off the chain ring to give you some free movement of the whole crank assembly. And there's two approaches here. Some people like to grab a quick link pliers like this and find your quick link on your chain and remove the quick link and remove the whole chain from the bike. I don't think it's necessary for what we're doing here. So what I'll do is I'll just put the chain to one side. So I have a SRAM pulley wheel at the back here. I'm going to lock it out to remove tension off the chain. And I'm just going to take the chain off the chainring and just let it dangle to the side. So at this stage, some people would go to the opposite side, opposite crank arm, the non-drive crank arm, and loosen the preload assembly. I don't find that's necessary. It's just one extra step, and we can deal with that preload adjustment when we're cleaning the whole assembly a bit later. So we're good to go right now to just remove the crank assembly with this 8mm hex bolt. Now, with these dub crank arms or crank assemblies, you have this cap here. This cap is necessary to stay in place for the self-extraction process to work properly. So, good news is you don't have to remove this cap, which requires a special tool, but you do need the 8mm hex wrench to be able to remove the whole assembly. So as I mentioned before, if you're relying on what a lot of people do, this type of 8mm hex wrench, you will find that if you've ridden your bike for more than a month or two, then to get the leverage off something with a small handle like this is going to be, I'm not going to try, it's going to be really hard to do. So that's why I recommend getting a breaker bar, or quite frankly, any other 8mm hex wrench that has a super long handle. You need leverage to be able to loosen this because this gets extremely tight. This is always one of the tightest bolts on the bike to loosen, and you just need leverage to make this process a whole lot easier. So that's where the two optional tools I talked about come in handy. And I'll show you how this works. Put this in first. Then I grab my frame and fork straightening tool. And hook it on top. And now I'm basically turning this bolt counterclockwise to loosen, like is usually the case. Not always, but usually the case is counterclockwise is loosening. And with these long handles, this is on so tight, but with a long handle and the leverage you can get, it really comes off easily. So with this dub process, this dub system, you want to keep turning it counterclockwise, and there might be a bit of pressure here, but this is how the self-extraction process works. It basically pulls it away from the whole assembly until the whole crank arm comes off entirely. Just like that. So there we are. So the whole crank assembly has come off. That's the top cap I was referring to earlier. And you actually need a special tool to be able to take that top cap off, but that's rarely ever has to be taken off. Normally you can just leave it there. And if you look at the opposite side, if I was changing the chainring, this is when I go about doing it. So basically to change your chainring, you basically have to loosen these three T25, I believe, hex bolts. So remove these three. This chainring comes off. You can put a new one on, grease it, lube it, tighten up the bolts to the proper tension, and then you're good to go from there. As you're removing all the parts, it's a good idea to keep track of how they're coming apart. So I like to, when I start to disassemble something, put them onto the table in the proper order so I know the order they go back to. So you're going to remove the crank arm. You're also going to find a spacer. So take that off, put it aside. And then you can sometimes this comes out easy, and sometimes you need the mallet. And I got lucky today. It actually came out without using the rubber mallet, but usually you do need a mallet to kind of knock it out, which is where that comes in handy. So I'll put that aside as well. And here I have a bearing seal or bearing cover. So put that aside. So that's basically all there is to disassembling the whole crankset. And now you can kind of look around. It's a good time to look around at your bottom bracket and your bearings and just go to both sides and just feel to make sure there's obviously no movement in the whole bottom bracket assembly and to make sure the bearings are spinning freely, which in this case, they're perfectly smooth. I can tell there's no grit. The bearings still have a lot of life in them. But if they weren't spinning freely, then in this case, since this is PressFit 30 format, I would have to remove these cups and reinsert new PressFit 30 cups and bearings all together in one assembly. But everything's good with the bottom bracket, so now we can go, and since we have everything apart, now's a good time to clean all the individual parts and then reapply lube and then reassemble. So that's what I'll do now. So you'll notice that on the crank assembly on the axle, there is the bearing cover. So you want to give this a good clean. There's a wave washer, which is essentially just almost like a preload adjuster. It is waved, of course, so it kind of fills in gaps. Then there's the preload adjuster assembly. This is the preload adjuster, and this is the inner threaded sleeve that fits inside. So this is actually the OEM SRAM preload adjuster, so it's what comes with the crankset. And these are notoriously delicate and not terribly fun to work with. And as you can see, this inner thread is just nylon. And when I was removing it earlier, it actually cracked and broke. So with that threaded piece broken, I can't use this adjuster. I'm going to replace this with a better aftermarket aluminum preload adjuster. And I have that on order, and when I receive it, I'll show you what that looks like and just explain why it's a better solution for your SRAM assembly. But for now, I will clean these parts and use them to reassemble. So you want to give this a good wipe down, and obviously we'll want to lube it before we reassemble it. But often the reason why the axle is difficult to remove from the bottom bracket assembly is this attracts a lot of grit and grime. And the more grit and grime you have in here, the more friction there is, the more difficult it is to remove this. So another reason why it just makes sense to do this easy maintenance once in a while, because if you leave it too long, removing all this is a more difficult process. So we'll just give it a good wipe down and make sure everything's cleaned. So that's pretty clean. And you want to make sure that you get in here. There's threads right here. So you want to make sure those are cleaned really well before we apply a new set of grease. But if you keep this clean and well lubed, the whole assembly is going to go on much easier, and you'll also be able to remove it a lot easier. So we'll now go and re-lube everything before reassembling it. And for the axle, basically the bearings run here and here. So that's really the important places to put some grease. We do have the preload adjuster that goes in here, and obviously we have this spindle here and threads in here. So we want to make sure that's well lubed. Just a little grease inside the spacer, a little bit for the preload, same here. Spacer I wouldn't worry about. The bearing cover can take a little bit. It'll just help to prevent water penetrating into the bearings. And the other bearing cover. That's it. We're good to start reassembling everything. And for the crank assembly, we want to relube these threads here, and a Q-tip is quite handy for that. So grab a bit of grease, grab a Q-tip, and just work it around the threaded assembly. Like that. That's it. Now we'll go about reassembling everything. Before I start reassembling the crankset, I will give it a bit of wipe down near the bottom bracket area, since this area is difficult to get at normally. So now's a good time to give it a good cleaning. And just like with the crankset parts where I clean them and grease them, I'm going to apply a bit of grease to the bottom bracket bearing assembly as well. And I forgot to put some on the inside of bearing, so I'm doing that now. Okay, so let's start reassembling everything. I have my axle here. I'm going to put my preload adjuster in. This one, as I mentioned, is broken, the threaded component, but for now, I'll just put it on. I can deal with that later. Put the wave washer on, as well as the bearing cover, bearing seal. So I grab it and start inserting it, starting at the non-drive side. Push it all the way. Grab my spacer, grab my bearing cover, I should say. That's why it's useful to put these things down in the proper order, which I didn't do perfectly here, so you know what order they go back on. So the bearing seal's on, my spacer's on, and now I can grab my drive side crank arm. Obviously this needs to be in a straight line to the one on the other side, and it'll go on like that. Grab my 8mm hex bolt or hex wrench and start screwing it on. So there is a proper torque setting, and in this case it's written right on the end cap here. It's 54 Newton meters of force. I don't have a torque wrench that registers that high, but you can go by feel too, but 54 Newton meters is a lot. So you can really tighten this. And I think that's about 54. The reality is this will tighten as you continue to ride. So even if it's not torqued up to the full 54 Newton meters, you're going to be good. Remove the breaker bar and the 8mm hex bolt or hex socket. and just give it a spin. Make sure it's spinning freely. It feels great. It feels nice and smooth. So we can just finish this off by putting the chain back on. And since we didn't remove the chain, putting it back on is quite easy. Just put it on the front chain ring, loosen up the pulley lockout. So that's all there is to removing and reinstalling your SRAM DUB crankset. Something you should do every once in a while as preventative maintenance, but something you're going to have to do eventually anyway, in that all bottom brackets wear out at some point and you'll need to remove the crankset assembly to get access to it. And chain rings as well eventually wear out. Something that people don't think about. People will think about replacing their chain, their cassette, their pulley wheels. And even though the chain ring is probably the last bit of the drivetrain to wear out and require replacing, they do eventually wear out. Mine wore out after 2 years, so I replaced it just last year. And is something that is good to keep an eye on. If you've tried everything else and your drivetrain still isn't shifting and working smoothly, then most likely your chain ring is worn out. So take a good close look at that. So a couple days have passed and I've received my new preload adjuster from Crane Creek. So I'm going to unbox this, or unsleeve this, and show you how to install it on the SRAM DUB crankset. So this is what you get with the Crane Creek preloader adjuster. So you get 2 inner threaded sleeves. This is for a 30 millimeter SRAM or race face axle. So since we're using SRAM DUB, this is not the one we want. This is the one that is specific to the SRAM DUB axle. So it's made for 28.9 millimeter assembly. And this is the collar. Sorry, this is the threaded inner collar. And this is the outer adjuster. So you can see how this just threads on, and by turning this, it tells you the direction for more or less preload. So this direction is for more preload. So the good thing about this is, oh, and you also get actually some really good instructions. Short, sweet, but shows you exactly what to do. So that's good to have. But this is how it's better than the stock SRAM preload adjuster, which comes with your crankset. This is, I think this is nylon. I think both these are nylon, and this is nylon, which for something that thin, you're just asking for it to break. So that's not a good design, in my opinion. This is not horrible, I mean this nylon, but it comes with a 2 millimeter hex bolt, whereas the Crane Creek one is a titanium, so it's already better, and a 2.5 millimeter hex bolt. So, you know, a 2.5 millimeter bolt is less likely to strip than a 2 millimeter bolt. But also you'll find that once it's on your crank arm and installed on your bike, it can be a bit tricky to locate this. Just a smaller target, quite frankly. So having a slightly larger bolt adds almost no additional weight, and it's just more practical. Also with the Crane Creek, these are all, so the bolt is titanium, everything else, these 2 pieces is aluminum. So still very light, but just more durable. So just a better overall design for, you know, a small price premium. But just a little point here is that these 2 inner sleeves, you have the silver one, which is designed for the SRAM DUB crankset, and then this gold one, which is for the standard 30mm axle. My crank here is the Truvative Stylo Dub Crank. That's how it was branded when I bought it. So I assumed that the whole crank set was dub, which meant that the axle as well was dub. But this is actually a standard 30mm axle. Can I do this? So this is a 30mm axle. So if anyone can kind of explain to me why this isn't a 28.99, please put it in the comments below. So I'm a bit confused with that, but it doesn't matter, as the preload adjuster works for either the dub cranksets or the standard 30mm. What I'll do now is, I have a bit of grease here. I'm going to apply some all-purpose, good quality premium bike grease to this area where the bearings are going to sit, as well as here, and a bit here, and on the inner threads. There we go. And this is now ready to reassemble. So just a little note on how this works. So it tells you the direction for positive preload. Positive preload will move this collar inbound, which will, of course, reduce any lateral play in your crank assembly. So that's why it's good to use a good preload adjuster. I have found that this on the OEM, the SRAM preload adjuster, I just find that I'm often getting play in my crankset, and it's because the preload adjuster has loosened up. So hopefully that'll happen less now. But essentially, yeah, you want to, once you have this reinstalled on your bike, you want to adjust this preload. So turn it for positive preload until it's fairly snug and there's no movement in your crank arm. And that's pretty much it. So to wrap this up, here's the 6-step process to how to remove and reinstall a SRAM DUB crankset. That's all I've got for today, folks. I hope you found some of this helpful. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you're not a subscriber to my channel, please subscribe so I can produce more content for all of you. See you next time. Happy rolling.